are going to share with you today some joint work on military policing in Cali, Colombia. Just by way of motivation, democratic theorists have long argued that a strict separation between the military and the police is key to transition to democracy and also to democratic consolidation. But if you look around the world, and especially in Latin America and indeed much of the global south, you see that this separation is routinely violated as governments rely on their armed forces to conduct basic domestic policing operations. So military policing of this sort is a defining feature of what's often called Mano Dura, or iron fist approaches to crime reduction, and you find examples of these approaches all over the world, from Brazil to Mexico, Guatemala, South Africa, Indonesia, etc. Now, advocates of these approaches, and then there are many advocates, argue that military policing reduces crime. And the basic intuition here is that soldiers may be more effective than police officers at deterring and incapacitating criminals because they have better communication, transportation, and logistical capacity, and because they have greater coercive capacity as well. And this line of argument is especially common in Latin America, where a lot of crime can be traced back to organized criminal syndicates that have proven to be quite difficult foes for police forces. Advocates also believe that military policing improves perceptions of safety. So Mano Dura is actually very popular, especially in Latin America. A majority of Latin American citizens believe that the military is more effective, more trustworthy, less corrupt, and less abusive than the police. And a majority of Latin American citizens also very specifically support military involvement in domestic policing operations. And those views aren't unique to Latin America. So you see similar patterns in sub-Saharan Africa, other parts of the global south. Now, opponents of these policies, and there are many opponents as well, argue that military policing undermines human rights. And the basic intuition here is that militaries differ dramatically from even the most heavily militarized police forces. They differ in the equipment they use, in the training they receive, in the relationships they develop with civilians, and perhaps most important, in the objectives they are expected to pursue. So whereas police forces are ostensibly designed to serve and protect, militaries are designed to overwhelm and defeat enemies on the battlefield. Right? And the intuition among opponents of these policies is that that ethos of overwhelm and defeat is fundamentally inappropriate for domestic policing operations. Dunlap makes this argument quite pointedly when he says, no one should suffer the illusion that military forces could ever execute the laws with the same sensitivity to civil liberties as regular police forces. To do so is at odds with the central imperatives of military service. Opponents also argue that military policing legitimizes retributive justice and delegitimizes the police. So Mano Dura is often associated with what's sometimes called right-wing penal populism, which essentially is the use or overuse of overly militaristic approaches to criminal justice to satisfy public demand for safety. So critics worry that military policing might increase support for the right-wing parties and politicians with whom these policies are most often associated, and that it might also generate support for other forms of retributive justice policies, restrictions on due process protections, for example. And critics also worry that if soldiers are perceived to be more effective than the police, then military policing might actually crowd out the police, essentially delegitimizing the police in the eyes of civilian populations. And at the extreme, opponents argue that military policing may undermine democratic governance itself. So it may generate demand for more intrusive forms of military involvement, not just in law enforcement, but in other aspects of governance as well, up to and including potentially support for military coups. Now, these accounts are almost all anecdotal. So Mano Dura is very common and it is very controversial, but with only a few exceptions, probably most notably the work of Gustavo, there's really very little empirical evidence on either side of this debate. So our contribution is going to be an experimental evaluation of the Plan Fortaleza program in Colombia, which involved recurring intensive military patrols in the city of Cali, which is one of the most violent cities in the world. Cali is probably best known as the home of the Cali cartel, which controlled much of the production and transshipment of cocaine from Colombia in the 1980s and 90s. This will be familiar to those of you who've watched Narcos on Netflix. I should say crime has declined precipitously since the days of the Cali cartel, but crime rates remain very high by both national and international standards, and Cali remains one of the most dangerous cities in the world. Just to spoil the punchline here, we're going to show you that we do find some evidence that Plan Fortaleza reduced the incidence of crime, but only when soldiers were physically present on the street. So at any other time, our effect estimates are basically nulls. We find no evidence of decreased crime victimization as reported by civilians or of improved perceptions of safety. We do, however, find quite strong evidence of increased crime witnessing, so civilians witnessing crimes in their neighborhoods, and also of increased willingness to report those crimes to the authorities, which we're going to attribute to heightened vigilance on the part of civilians, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. We do find some evidence of increased abuses, although the evidence here is quite mixed, and the abuses that we detect appear to have been committed almost exclusively by the police rather than by the military per se. We find strong evidence of increased demand for more aggressive military intervention, not just military intervention for policing, but also military intervention in governance. So, for example, we find an increase in support for military coups. We find no evidence of increased turnout for right-wing candidates. So here we're testing this penal populist idea that exposure to military policing might drive civilians towards right-wing parties and politicians. And to test that idea, we are going to exploit the fact that Cali held mayoral elections right in the middle of the intervention that we're evaluating. And so that allows us to test whether civilians who were exposed to military policing at the very local level were more likely to vote for right-wing candidates in those mayoral elections. We find that they basically were not. We do, however, find some suggestive, and it really is quite suggestive evidence of decreased support for left-wing protests. And here we're going to exploit the fact that immediately after the intervention was complete, Colombia witnessed a series of massive nationwide strikes that were organized by a consortium of left-leaning organizations. And so we're going to test whether exposure to military policing in the context of this program drove people away from those protests, right? Caused them to lower their support for those protests and made them less likely to participate. We find some suggestive evidence that it did. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about this intervention. So Plan Fortaleza, this was a program designed to target crime hotspots in 2 of Cali's most violent comunas. As part of the program, teams of 6 to 8 soldiers from 2 units of the military, the Special Forces and the Military Police, would patrol every weekday night from 5 p.m. to midnight, accompanied by civilian monitors. And those monitors were there basically to help them navigate to particular blocks. These neighborhoods are very difficult to navigate, and also were there to try to monitor the incidents of any abuses committed by those soldiers. We'll talk more about the monitors in just a minute. While they were on patrol, the soldiers would search for drugs and weapons. They would check IDs and business licenses. They would erect roadblocks, talk with civilians, and they would detain suspected criminals until the police arrived. Now, this is an important point here. So the military in Colombia does not actually have the legal authority to effect arrests. So if they catch a criminal committing a crime, they have to detain that individual and then essentially wait for the police to come and take them to the station or to jail. The program ran from September 30th to November 18th of 2019. So we randomized assignment to the Plan Fortaleza program at the city block level. So we stratified by neighborhood, and then we assigned 1/6 of all city blocks in each neighborhood to treatment out of 1,255 blocks in total. The patrols were quite short, so they lasted just 11 minutes per block per night on average, and that's because these blocks are really small. So a team of 6 to 8 soldiers can cover a lot of ground very quickly. The average block, if I'm not mistaken, was sort of around 200 meters in diameter, in circumference. Now, because these blocks are quite small and the neighborhoods are densely populated and difficult to navigate, we knew from the outset that the risk of spillover effects was probably going to be quite high. So what we decided to do was assign any block that was adjacent to a treatment block to a spillover group and any non-adjacent blocks to control. So essentially, we're estimating a really simple spillover model here where there's the possibility that it affects spillover from a treated block to any block that is immediately surrounding that treated block, but not any further than that. We are going to model more complex spillover dynamics, so a linear decay, an exponential decay, a saturation model. We basically don't find any evidence of those dynamics at work, so we won't talk about them more here, but we can return to them in the Q&A if you're interested. Just to fix ideas, so this is what the treatment schedule actually looked like. This is probably a little bit hard for you guys to see on your screens, but the green dots here, those denote treatment blocks, the yellow dots denote spillover blocks, and the red dots denote control. Okay, so we collected a lot of data for this evaluation, and we're going to combine data from 6 different sources. So first, we collected administrative data on crime. And one of the nice things about Cali is that it has very high quality crime data. So every week or two, the police will meet with the mayor's office, the attorney general's office, and the coroner's office to triangulate their various data sources to try to approximate as closely as possible the true prevalence of homicides and other violent crimes in the city. So we have that data time-stamped and geolocated down to the city block level. We're also going to collect data on human rights abuses. This is collected by the Office of the Attorney General. The Attorney General is responsible for investigating and prosecuting abuses committed by both the police and the military. These are essentially denuncias made by civilians. So civilians will see an abuse and they will call that in to the Attorney General's office. That data, again, is going to be time-stamped and geolocated down to the city block level. These monitors who accompanied the soldiers on patrol carried GPS devices with them. So we essentially have real-time GPS data that allows us to track where each of the patrols went each night of the intervention. And then the monitors also recorded their firsthand observations of what went on during these patrols. So essentially, whether the soldiers made it, whether they busted a drug deal, or whether they set up a roadblock, or whether they committed an abuse. I should say these monitors, they were told to be very discreet, so they essentially sat in the back of the trucks while these soldiers were patrolling. They didn't get out. Michael will tell you more about this in just a little bit. Obviously, we were worried about Hawthorne effects, or the possibility that the soldiers might change their behavior because they knew that monitors were in the back of their trucks with them. That was essentially a cost that we decided we had to bear because of our own ethical responsibility to track abuses. And this was something that the government wanted to do as well, right? If the soldiers went out and started abusing civilians, the government wanted to be able to pull the plug on the intervention, and we wanted to be able to pull the plug on the evaluation. As it happens, we think that these monitors, the soldiers acclimated to the presence of the monitors quite quickly. Michael and I went on ride-alongs with the military outside of our study area, and I can tell you that they certainly did not seem to care about the presence of two very conspicuous gringos in the back of their truck when we were with them. Because these monitors were with the same soldiers over and over and over again over the course of nearly 2 months, we suspect that they habituated very quickly to their presence. But that's just an important caveat to keep in mind, that we're evaluating the effects of military patrols in the presence of civilian monitors. We're also going to run 2 surveys. So the first is a monitoring survey. So this reached about 2,000 residents and business owners. The survey was conducted continuously throughout the course of the intervention and then continued for about a month after the intervention was complete. And then we also conducted a much larger inline survey of about 8,000 residents and business owners. That completed about 2 to 3 months after the intervention was over. That survey is going to include a forced choice image-based conjoint experiment, which we're going to use to measure attitudes towards military and the police. We owe Gustavo a huge debt of gratitude for the design of that experiment. This was essentially a sort of a bastardized version of an experiment that he had run in the past. We also have a behavioral measure for demand for military policing. So essentially what we did is we set up a hotline that civilians could text or call in order to request additional military presence on their blocks. And we're able to trace those calls and text back to the specific city blocks where they originated. And then we're going to use that as a measure for citizens' willingness to take a sort of costly action to demand additional military presence in their neighborhoods. And then finally, about 7 months after the intervention, we conducted interviews with about 49 civil society leaders. And we're going to use those interviews to try to understand the political effects of the intervention, and also to try to understand any abuses that might have been perpetrated during the course of the intervention. Okay, and I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. I'm going to share my screen here. You all are seeing my slides, yes? Yes? Super. Okay, so I'm going to begin talking about some of the ethical considerations that are associated with an intervention and evaluation of this sort. So Plan Fortaleza predated our evaluation, would have occurred whether we evaluated it or not, but we did take a number of measures to try to protect various parties involved, residents, respondents, enumerators who are conducting our surveys, as well as the civilian monitors that Rob mentioned. So to protect residents, we used our Attorney General's data and some firsthand observations from the civilian monitors to document and then report any claims of abuses that stem from civilians. And I'll talk a lot about abuses and the data that we use to test that in just a minute. We established direct lines of communication with monitors, field supervisors, the civilian leaders who in the mayor's office oversee the police and military actions in the field to protect the ride-along monitors. As Rob mentioned, these monitors needed to remain in the vehicles with soldiers at all times. They used armbands indicating very, very clearly that they were civilians. We outfitted them with bulletproof vests just in case clashes did occur between the military and criminal actors. We also only recruited monitors who didn't live in our study comunas, just in case criminals could identify the faces of those who were riding along with the military, which would of course put them at risk. And finally, we gave monitors this custom-made smartphone app, which would allow them to very quietly, discreetly record all interactions of the sort that Rob mentioned between soldiers and civilians, which includes abuses. I consulted tons of sources, including local civil society leaders, to identify some blocks that may have been too dangerous to survey, and we just simply dropped these from the survey sample. And we made sure that surveying ended every day by noon to avoid having folks in the field even close to nighttime. We could spend plenty of time talking about these and our other measures that we adopted and other issues related to ethics. If you guys want, we can talk about that maybe in the Q&A. Okay, so let's talk about estimation and then results. So we're going to estimate our intention to treat, our ITT, and spillover effects at the individual and block levels, obviously depending upon what outcome we're interested in, what dependent variable we're looking at. For the block level regressions, we're going to include a set of covariates such as distance to the nearest police station, the military battalion, public transportation, hubs, and so forth. At the individual level, when we run individual level regressions, we're going to add individual level covariates such as age, gender, and other stuff, and we're going to cluster standard errors at the block level, which is the level of randomization. So finally, we simulate and then include block level inverse probability weights to weight observations by the inverse probability of assignment to the realized treatment status. So Rob already mentioned this, but when using administrative crime data in the aggregate, we find no evidence of crime reduction, either during, that's the first column results here in this table, or after the intervention, that's that second column of results. And that's basically just in the aggregate. But this does mask some really interesting findings, some interesting heterogeneity. So here we find evidence that the patrols did in fact reduce crime when soldiers were physically present on the streets, that is during the week and at night. Remember, we only sent these folks out to their treatment blocks during the week and at night. While the intervention was ongoing, we see a tenth of a standard deviation reduction in this weighted crime index that we construct on treatment blocks, and a reduction of roughly the same magnitude on spillover blocks. Only this effect for spillover blocks is statistically significant, but the two are weakly jointly significant as well. Let's look at crime victimization. So we find no evidence that the program reduced crime victimization either during, that's that first column of results, or after, that's the second column of results. After the intervention, the patrols did increase reporting, that witnessing crime, by more than a tenth of a standard deviation on treatment blocks and nearly 2/10 of a standard deviation on spillover blocks. And we think that what's going on here is it's likely that the Plan Fortaleza, these military patrols, caused residents to be more vigilant, and therefore they witnessed crimes that they would have otherwise basically ignored. We can come back to that interpretation of the results at the end if you're interested. We find no evidence that these patrols improved the subjective perceptions of safety among residents, although we do find some evidence all the way on the right-hand side of this table that business owners did feel safer in the presence of these military patrols. Why might we find these divergent results? Normal residents, no results. Business owners, we see improvements in perceptions of subjective security. These folks are more likely to be present during patrols. They're more likely to interact with soldiers. When Rob and I went on our ride-alongs, we actually got out at various moments and bought water or bought some bread or some snacks. And we think that this may help explain why we see an effect for subjective perceptions of safety among business owners, but not regular residents. It may also be the case that these business owners are really focused on particular kinds of threats posed by gangs that military patrols may help resolve, particularly extortion, and therefore they may be really receptive to these patrols. We're going to measure the perceptions of police and army, asking respondents a ton of questions about the legitimacy of each. We find that these patrols improve perceptions of the military in the end line by 0.08 standard deviations on treatment blocks. That's that second column of results that you see in this table here. Although we don't find something similar on spillover blocks, we find also no evidence that the military patrols worsen perceptions of the police, which would be this kind of substitution effect, whereas you increase the perceptions of the legitimacy of the military, and that seems to degrade perceptions of the police. We don't actually find support for that. Rob already mentioned that to get a demand for military policing, we use this costly behavioral measure. That's the result all the way to the right in this table, the right-handmost column. So we provided respondents with this flyer that provides it gave a phone number of a hotline they could text or call if they wanted military patrols on their block. And we find that patrols did increase demand for military policing itself. So compared to control blocks, this hotline received far more calls and texts from for requesting military patrols from treatment and spillover blocks. We're talking about roughly 200% more on treatment blocks and 100% more on spillover blocks compared to the control group mean. These are really large effects. And in other words, individuals who are exposed to military patrols basically wanted more. All right, this is the part where we stole from Gustavo and Jess Zarkin, who's a grad student at Cornell. So we implement this image-based force conjoint experiment, basically to try to get at perceptions of the military relative to the police. So we present respondents with pairs of images. So we have an image that either showed a soldier or a police officer carrying either an assault rifle or a pistol. The soldier and the assault rifle for us are obvious signs or signals of militarization. And respondents were showed these two profiles side by side randomly and then asked which of them made them feel safer, which was more likely to deter crime, which was more likely to commit abuses, and which was more likely to be corrupt. And so we see a strong preference for military policing in this conjoint experiment, driven by positive perceptions for the military as expected. Respondents did prefer the assault rifle over the pistol, but they preferred soldiers, the military uniform, over police officers by much larger margins. And this preference for the military over the police is even stronger on treatment blocks. So it seems like the intervention is actually inducing this preference for the military over the police. Okay, here we're going to test the effects of military patrols on some political attitudes and behaviors. So we exploit two events that occurred, one that occurred during the intervention and one that occurred immediately thereafter. So we test first whether the program increased turnout of right-wing candidates in elections for mayor that occurred while the intervention was ongoing. We find no increase for support for conservative candidates. We think that this null can basically be explained by the fact that all candidates who are running for mayor supported military patrols. There simply wasn't any variation. And in fact, our qualitative interviews with nearly 50 civil society leaders and a desk review of policy proposals by these candidates, in fact, reinforced that idea that there's not really any variation in support for military patrols among those who are running. And second, we find that respondents on treatment blocks were weakly less supportive of these anti-government protests that occurred just after implementation of the military patrols evaluation ended. But we're no more or less likely to participate in them. So basically here we see, in other words, some evidence that patrols are in fact inducing conservative attitudes, although that's not uniform across the board. So in contrast to what we expected to find, we find no evidence that military patrols increase support for retributive justice policies. They did, however, increase support for military involvement in governance, and that's on the right-hand side here of this table. On treatment and spillover blocks, folks were more likely to support military coups. This is a particularly concerning, depressing, worrying byproduct of military patrols. And actually, once we disaggregate potential support for coups in response to different threats, we can actually see that military patrols only increase support for coups in response to the threat of crime, and not in response to the threat of corruption, which is what you see here. And this is obviously in line with the kinds of behavioral or attitudinal changes that we would have expected the program to have, right? It's through, obviously we wouldn't expect to increase support for coups across the board, just in response to the kind of threat that military patrols are intended to resolve. Okay, so let's turn to abuses finally. So here, using the Attorney General's data on these state security force abuses, human rights abuses, as well as data gathered by our civilian monitors who are on patrols, we find no increase in abuses by the military. The one abuse that did occur during the intervention, you can kind of see it here. It's like an exploding crackerjack. I don't quite know what to call that here. That one event that occurred had absolutely nothing to do with the intervention. We did quite a bit of research into exactly what happened there, and it was completely orthogonal, unrelated to what happened during the intervention. In our monitoring survey, however, we do see some suggestive evidence of increased abuses by soldiers on treatment blocks. These effects are actually pretty small and only weakly significant. And verbal and physical abuse was actually really rare by soldiers. So we see just roughly 10 out of 2,100 folks during the survey reporting either verbal or physical abuse. And the vast majority of these cases, they actually occur in the context of the same incident. So they go kind of hand in hand. And none of the 10 monitoring survey respondents who reported military abuse was actually surveyed while the intervention was ongoing. So it's very likely that these events occurred after the intervention had already ended. We do find, however, some evidence quite robust, of increased abuse by the police as a result of the treatment. So we have like 3% of respondents reporting at least one incident of physical or verbal abuse by the police on their block. And again, physical and verbal abuse by the police also occur typically in the context of the same incident. And it could be, we think it's plausible that these police abuses basically occur when police arrive to a block to make arrests in the company of soldiers. And here we can just see exactly what I just mentioned, just in table form. So we see a much larger increase in physical abuse among the police, both physical and verbal when compared to the military. And we see only a very weak, statistically significant relationship between treatment and abuse by soldiers. Okay, so we have a bunch of puzzles, some things that we kind of we're struggling for explanations for. We wrestle with a bunch of them in the paper. We have 4, I think, in the paper. I'll just talk very briefly about one here. So we basically find that military policing has these weak or null effects on crime victimization, perceptions of safety. And so it's pretty natural to ask, like, why is it that folks consistently want more of this thing, even though they don't themselves feel more safe in the presence of soldiers? And so one possibility is that these respondents, ordinary citizens, feel that military patrols help curb police corruption. They help rein in some bad behavior by the police. And here's a quote from one of our interviews that we conducted, which says, "Of course, yes, I support them, the military patrols. I live in fear of the police." That's one potential mechanism that helps explain demand for police, even though we don't see improvements in victimization and perceptions of safety. Another potential explanation is that folks believe that military policing will make them safer, even if it doesn't. And here we have this quote: "Here in Cali, young people have lots of respect for soldiers. The police they don't respect. The young slackers on the street listen to the military." Another possibility is that even though military policing doesn't improve perceptions of security, the status quo in these places is simply just so bad that we see increases in demand for military policing. We'd love to hear if you guys have ideas for helping us think through this puzzle, that'd be fantastic. Okay, so just to conclude here, basically the existing evidence suggests that military policing basically has all these negative secondary consequences. This includes a lot of work by Gustavo. But basically, our experimental results from Cali are a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more mixed. The results don't seem as severe as some critics believe. That is, we don't see this explosion of abuse by soldiers, at least in the case of Cali. And the benefits, on the other hand, on the other side of the ledger, the benefits aren't really as impressive as the proponents would have us believe. So we think that given this balance, we think that policymakers should probably consider alternative approaches when they're attempting to reduce crime in some of the world's most violent places. And that's what we've got for you today. We're looking forward to your questions and comments. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Michael and Rob. This is excellent. I mean, I'm just in awe how much you've done in this research. But let's open this to questions. I see that one was already asked. I think we have a small enough group that if anybody wanted to actually voice their question, they could raise your hand and we'll unmute. It looks like Rob maybe sort of chimed in already to answer Rebecca Belmartin's question. But Rebecca, if you wanted to follow up, please feel free. And Ken, I see your hand up as well. If you're in the queue, or is this about something else? But if you're in the queue, maybe I'll see if Rebecca wants to follow up. Or if
I can unmute Rebecca if you wish.
Yeah, let's do that.
That'd be good.
Okay, Rebecca, you're on.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, this is a bit of a selfish question, so I'll tell you why. I hope you guys can elaborate. So I work in Mexico and I do a lot of participant observation field research. And one thing that I've seen a lot of is citizens. So when the military patrols come around the neighborhood, citizens will go out of their houses to monitor the military patrols because they're actually what they're actually doing is monitoring them to make sure they're not abusing civilians or doing other things that they're not supposed to do. And so I'm curious to know if you're actually capturing witnessing crime, but the actual mechanism is this other thing, which is something you could call monitoring potential human rights abuses. Just
So
an additional hypothesis.
just to make sure I understood, so the idea is, so I think that the dynamic that you're describing, I do think that occurred in Cali, where you had, possibly to a lesser extent than in Mexico, but I do think you had civilians coming out to sort of watch what was going on. Is your idea that they were coming out to monitor the military, but sort of as a byproduct of that, they saw crimes that they wouldn't otherwise have witnessed? Is that what you're thinking?
Exactly. So like I would never have even gone out of my house to pay attention to what was going on in my street if I didn't see the military convoy come by. And these all could be true as well. Like these are simultaneously things that could simultaneously be happening.
I think that's totally plausible, Rebecca. Thanks so much for the comment. One thing that we had also kind of thought about is that folks, like, these patrols make noise. And it could be that folks are like not sleeping as much as they otherwise would have, and are kind of coming out of their houses and witnessing crimes that would have occurred regardless, right? But now that they're more vigilant, now that they're awake and more able to witness crime, that's a potential mechanism as well. But this is one that honestly I hadn't really considered, and I think is totally plausible. So thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah, and just a couple quick additions to that. So one, just as an aside, so I think this dynamic is precisely why we weren't as worried about the presence of the civilian monitors in the trucks as we might otherwise have been, or at least less worried about Hawthorne effects, because we knew, these are densely packed urban neighborhoods. These soldiers are being monitored by civilians all the time, right? So people are watching what they do when they go around these neighborhoods. We didn't think that having an additional civilian in the truck, it's possible, but we didn't think that was likely to have really large marginal effects on their behavior. Yeah, and I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Thanks for the response. Really interesting.
Thank you, Rebecca, for your question. Ken.
Yeah, well, thanks, Rob and Michael, for this presentation. It's a really impressive body of research. Just look at the different layers of what you're doing here and the different kinds of evidence that you bring to bear. So it's very impressive, and I'm really struck by the results, and I guess I'm kind of struggling with it because what you're giving us is a very nuanced picture, in trying to think through the actual empirical effect, and then sort of there's a subjective dimension to how people are responding, which does not always seem to align with the actual effects on the ground. And that's part of what sort of jumps out at me in your results. And I find that quite interesting. And it seems clear to me that the kinds of reactions you're going to get are going to be heavily conditioned by how people do view the alternatives, namely the police, and how corrupt is the police, how violent is the police, how effective is the police. And so I would imagine you could get considerable variation from one country, from one city to another, depending upon the alternative kinds of institutions. I'm also curious too, given that it seems as if part of the effects are influenced by the fact that the citizens themselves are more observant and are monitoring things more closely if there are military patrols. I'm just curious, what do you think would be the response if, rather than military patrols, what if you had civic patrols, community-based organizations that were assuming different kinds of security functions and sponsoring local people from the community to go out and do neighborhood watch kinds of activities? And that's obviously not something that's part of your research design here, but I'm just curious as to, given what you see in terms of the effects of military patrols, what would you anticipate the consequence, the effects might be of having a very different kind of patrol in the
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, I mean, I can take a crack at that first question, Michael, if you want to take a crack at the second. Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. There likely would be variation, not just from one country or one city to another, but also potentially from one neighborhood to another within Cali, and maybe even from one household to another. Insofar as the effects of the patrols on your perceptions, for example, are going to vary depending on your priors about the military. We don't have a baseline, so unfortunately, we can't test that directly. Maybe one thing to note here is that the Colombian military, it has a rather checkered history in Colombia. Now, most of the abuses perpetrated by the military were perpetrated out in rural areas, so not in the sorts of area in the sorts of places that we were working. But even in Cali, there was a history of the Colombian military collaborating with the Cali cartel back in the 80s and 90s. So I think in some respects it's sort of striking that Cali residents nonetheless seem to have a strong preference for the military over the police, and I think that gets to your point about the what they're making the comparison to, right? So it's not like the choice set available to them is a military with a checkered past or a perfectly capable, beneficent, just police force. That's not the comparison that they're making, right? They're making a comparison between two institutions, both of which have something of a checkered past. And so, in that sense, it's not all that surprising that they would drift towards the military rather than the police. But I'll let Michael take up from there.
No, I mean, I think the only thing I'd add is, so it is very clear that folks in Colombia overwhelmingly prefer the military. However, we do know from some survey experiments by La Matonate and Miguel Garcia at Los Andes that folks, particularly in conflict areas, tend to overstate their support for the military. So when you use some endorsement experiments, you find that actually the gap between support for the military and the police narrows significantly. People are afraid of the military much more so than they are of the police, and therefore tend to over kind of exaggerate their support for the military because they fear them. But having said that, I think overwhelmingly folks prefer the military to the police, in part for the reasons that Rob mentioned, kind of the motivation for this paper, which is organized crime is kind of is one of the core problems, and that tends to lead to corruption of police forces. And there's a perception that the military is less subject to at least that kind of corruption, at least today. Maybe less so, 20 or 30 years ago. So people definitely our prior was that as we increase support for the military as a result of this intervention, we should see kind of this decreases of support for the police. And one surprising thing is that we actually didn't see that. And I'm not 100% sure why that's the case. We may be kind of coming up against floor effects. That is, we can't reduce support for the police any more than it already is. But these are just kind of some thoughts off the top of my head. Thanks, Ken, for your comments and questions.
Just very briefly on your second comment, Ken, your second question. So yeah, it's hard to say what the effects of civic patrols would be, but I think
sorry.
If we had infinite statistical power, so initially we wanted to actually have a sort of a two-armed treatment here. Just logistically and also for reasons of statistical power, it didn't turn out to be possible. But I would love to directly compare. Maybe it's a comparison of like military patrols to increase police patrols to increase civic patrols, and kind of do a sort of horse race of that sort. But yeah, it's a great idea.
Thank you. We have another question. Or Ken, do you want to? No? Okay. We have another question. This says, there are recent reports that show that General Attorney's Office has uncovered continuous human rights abuses from the military and police forces, such as assassination of civilians and their presentation as guerrilla members, or the false positives. Yep. To what extent do you think that the Attorney Office's reports are reliable?
I can take a stab at this maybe. So there's a long history of the Colombian military engaging in human rights abuses. There since the mid 2000s, particularly during the second administration of Uribe, there was a history of the Colombian military collaborating with paramilitary organizations, and in the case of the false positives, recruiting very poor, oftentimes handicapped individuals from cities, promising them rewards, jobs in the countryside, and assassinating them and dressing them up as guerrilla kills. And there are some great papers on exactly how this worked and how this was a consequence, basically of high-powered incentives that were provided to the Colombian military, which provided some really kind of horrible secondary unintended consequences. So how reliable I'm circling back to the question, how reliable are the reports from the Attorney General's office? So it's very clear that, I have to be very diplomatic here. It's very clear that the reports that have come out of the HEP, which is the Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, which is the Transitional Justice Court, about 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago max, they released an auto about the false positive scandal, and they number over 6,000 the number of false positives, and this pales in comparison to the number that the Attorney General had originally said, which I think is 2,500. So it's very clear that there's massive undercounting, and there's politics here. And so I would definitely trust the HEP, the Transitional Justice Court, in this particular moment in time over what the Attorney General's office is saying. Thanks for the question.
I would also say, so I think two points related to the Attorney General's office data in Cali specifically. So one, again, I think the fact that this is a densely populated urban environment, something of the magnitude of a false positive scandal would be very hard to pull off in Cali proper, right? Because there are people all around who can observe what's actually going on. Now, that obviously that doesn't mean that there's no undercounting, but I think it's less likely in an urban environment like Cali than it would be out in the in the rural areas. But the second point, and we were obviously very we were certainly very sensitive to the difficulty of measuring this outcome. To us, this was a key outcome of the evaluation. There's no perfect way to measure it, and so that's the reason why we decided to measure it in 4 different ways, right? So we would get the Attorney General's the office from the Attorney General's office, the data from the Attorney General's office. We would get the first-hand observations from the civilian monitors. We would run this monitoring survey, and then we would also run an inline survey, and all of those measures were designed in part to pick up abuses. And so none of them is going to be perfect, right? There could be under or over counting in any one of those sources, but the hope is we can sort of triangulate between them to get something closer to the true prevalence.
Thank you. I'll ask a question about, one of the things that I love about this study is that you really have so many different windows post-treatment, right? It's not just, do people remember the day after or a week after? I mean, you're measuring this 2 months, at 3 months, at 7 months, different measures. And you have not only the attitudinal aspect, but even behavioral, the opportunity for people to call a hotline. One of the questions that I have has to do with, and I think this might be a bit particular to the Colombian case, that the National Police is part of the Ministry of Defense. In Cali, to what extent do people can tell? My recollection is that the National Police wear some green uniform. Could you say a little bit about people's ability to distinguish, these soldiers from the National Police? I'm guessing from the local police it's a lot easier. If you could maybe speak to that.
I'll maybe just take this very quickly. So all police is national in Colombia. So in the sense that, there's no distinction, right, between national and local police in terms of the uniforms they wear. So, if I'm a police officer, I can be sent to Buenaventura, I can be sent to Quibdó, I can be sent to Cali or wherever. And so there's no distinction between local, well, in that sense, there's no distinction between the perception of local and national police. There's a distinction between riot police and ordinary kind of beat cops, and they look quite different. But even the folks that look closest to the kinds of soldiers that were participating in our patrols look very, very different from this riot police. So the riot police, we call them like robo-cops because they actually look like robo-cops. They have these kind of this kind of chunky kinds of uniforms, and the military police very clearly has MP and then has Army on the back of their bulletproof vests. And so we actually have two forces that we're working with. We're working with special forces and we're working with military police. And the military and police and special forces actually don't look very similar, but they're both very clearly quite different from ordinary police. So I don't think there's any world in which folks are confusing the ordinary police with the kinds of people who are participating in our study, or even this riot police with the military folks who are participating in our study. I don't know, Rob, if you wanted to add anything there.
No, I mean, I would agree with that. I think that they really and the soldiers that go out, they're wearing flak jackets, most of them are wearing helmets, they're carrying assault rifles, they're wearing full body gear and body armor in some cases. So you really, they don't look like cops. The closest analog would be the ESMAD, the riot police, as Michael mentioned, but even they look quite different. So I think probably in general, folks are distinguishing, and I think in the case of like the conjoint, for example, we're really giving them images that clearly delineate, this is a cop, this is a soldier. So that would be my sense.
I don't know if you can see this, but this is just one kind of instance of what some of these guys look like, and they really do look. It's very clearly camouflaged, and that's not anything like what the police look like. Thanks, Gustavo.
No, perfect. That's really helpful just to visualize sort of the difference, the camo plus compared to just a regular green, sort of plain green. What I just think one of the things that your study does that I don't think I've seen done in the developing world, and that I think is just very effective and great that you do this, is actually show some evidence in terms of crime, right? I mean, the literature points to all of these byproducts or externalities of bringing the military, but rarely does it actually measure whether crime goes up or down, right? We can think about human rights violations and other things that are undesirable, but perhaps we could even think about a trade-off, right? If crime goes down by X, how much of a to what extent human rights violations can be acceptable, right? And your paper is one of the first that I see doing this, and I think that's just a huge contribution that I think you should really play up because you have so many contributions here that it's one that I think should really be highlighted that I haven't seen elsewhere. And then another thing that I was wondering was this sort of nuanced finding about business owners that might have a lot more interaction with the actual patrols. It just, I think, really speaks to the importance of the actual interaction, right? As opposed to hearing from someone that the military were patrolling there. In the questionnaire, do you actually ask people whether they saw the patrols or interacted with the treatment?
We asked, I'm trying to remember, we definitely asked that they saw the patrol. So we use that just as basically a sort of a manipulation check. So we can show, on treatment blocks, our survey respondents are much more likely to report having seen soldiers patrolling around, which is exactly what we would expect. I can't remember, Michael, if we asked them specifically whether they individually interacted with the soldiers.
Yeah, so we have, how often have you seen or heard about police on this block? Then we ask, how often have you seen or heard, police or military, how often have you seen or heard about police or military patrolling or talking to citizens on this block? Then we ask, checking identity. I mean, we have like a bunch of questions about whether they've heard or seen particular kinds of interactions. And so that's kind of the way, that's kind of how we're measuring things there. But individual interactions, as in personally interacted with, it's a good question. I don't remember.
And I don't think that's necessary. I mean, I think if I see a military patrol, I would never go out and try to interact with them, right? But just whether I saw them from my window, those kinds of things. And if you do have any measure along those lines, I think that would go a long way to then showing that, people are really responding to the visualization of the military, even if they're not interacting with it. But just that nuance between people who were in the neighborhood who just weren't aware of the treatment or the operation, and those who actually saw it, and the power, how that is powerful to shape perceptions. I think that would be huge. And I think in a way that sort of is a thread that could, or I guess that's the needle that could thread some of these different findings that might, in principle, seem a little contradictory, but that make a lot of sense when you put it in those terms.
Yeah, absolutely. We should go back to the survey instrument and see if there's anything else that we have in there that would let us get at this. Not off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but we'll definitely take a look.
Ken.
Yeah, can I just follow up? This question of the visualization is intriguing to me, and in some way it connects to this big question that I'm grappling with, which has to do with your finding about how this leads to increased support for a military coup, for some sort of, shift in the government. And, I'm just curious as to what would really be, what are the mechanisms, I guess, that produce that, given the the lack of any particular effect in terms of the effectiveness of this in reducing crime or anything else. But is it the case where this simply sort of the presence of the military doing patrols in the neighborhood, things that are conventionally thought of as civic institutional responsibilities? Is this just simply a way of reinforcing the sense that civilian political institutions are deficient and incapable, and that if you really want to make, if you really want things to function, you got to bring in the serious guys from the military? Is that what you think is going on here, or how do you interpret that particular finding? Because it's an interesting and obvious, it's a disturbing finding. If we're finding that there is general, widespread support for military policing and a military intervention in domestic security matters, and if that military involvement, in fact, leads, in a Mano Dura kind of strategies, if this does lead to greater support for military intervention in politics, it's highly worrisome for Latin American democracy moving forward, not just in Colombia, but in Brazil and Mexico and Central America. There's so much of the region that is going through some version of this.
My sense is that the military, in the process of carrying out these patrols, demonstrates its competence, and folks mentally kind of stack that up against the police, and they associate the police with civilian leadership, and when making that comparison, they very clearly would prefer something that works over something that doesn't. Now, we find these kind of, I don't know, I don't want to call them weak effects on crime, but they're highly local. That is, we only see crime reduction when soldiers are on the street. But I think regardless, folks definitely are making the comparison to the police and civilian leadership, and are seeing the competence of the military, and prefer an expanded role for military leadership to solve the core problems. I wish we had asked more questions about military engagement and governance. Like it would have been a really good thing to know, to what extent, or how extensive would people like that military engagement and governance to be? We have a very kind of rough way of proxying that here with the military coups, but the military, could play a variety of different roles in governance, and unfortunately, we don't measure those in our survey. Rob, I don't know if you wanted to comment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this at least was not an effect that I really anticipated. I think that had we known that we were going to see this, we probably would have asked a lot more questions. I will say, just as an aside, we've really been wrestling with how to interpret these effects on crime. So I think for a while there, really up until a few weeks ago, we sort of were interpreting this as basically a null. That yes, you get these effects, but they're very temporally localized to the times when soldiers are physically present on the streets. But then when we've presented this paper to economists and criminologists, they've told us, actually, these effects are, first of all, they're very large. In magnitude, they're quite large. You're talking about a 44% reduction in crimes on spillover blocks relative to control. I can't remember what the other numbers are, but that's a substantively very large effect. And if you sort of compare this to other sort of hotspots policing interventions, it's not altogether unlike what you tend to see, right? So it's not typical for a hotspot policing intervention to generate effects on crime even after the police are no longer there. And so to expect that this would generate effects not just during the intervention when the soldiers aren't on the streets, but maybe even after the intervention was over, maybe that was just an unreasonable expectation on our part. And maybe civilians don't share that unreasonable expectation, right? Maybe to them, if there's a deterrent effect, even just for the, just for those days and times, just for weekday nights, that's enough. That's enough to say this is really making things better, even though it, again, it isn't affecting perceptions of safety, but still, I think we're sort of coming to the view that maybe this was a little bit more effective than we had initially interpreted it to be.
Albeit with the, what Gustavo was kind of mentioning with, trying to keep all these results in mind at the same time and thinking like, from a kind of welfare analysis kind of perspective, like how many human rights abuses would there have to be to swamp the positive social benefits of crime reduction? That's not an easy thing to do. Like we've steered clear of trying to do like an actual formal welfare analysis, but I think that's a totally plausible kind of way to think about this. That there are pluses and minuses, and like once you start stacking one against the other, it's difficult to know where to come down.
Thank you so much for this. I think, on behalf of everyone who attended your talk, this is just really impressive. And we're very grateful that you were able to present your work and share these findings with us. And we also hope that it's not the last time that you do this, because, you're constantly generating just very interesting work along these lines. So thank you so much. Virtual applause from all of us. And Ken, I don't know if you want to say a few things to conclude.
No, I just, on behalf of the Latin American Studies program, we want to thank you for your presentation today. You've given us a lot to think about, and as I said, we've got a number of people that are working on these related issues, and so it's great to see the latest from your research agenda. And we wish you all the best as you keep moving it forward. So it's great work. Thanks for sharing it with us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you guys.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, really, really, really helpful. Thank you very much.